I love all the different types of fabric for cross-stitching on, but I probably do have a preference for using evenweave or linen over Aida. However, one downside to these fabrics is that counting stitches, or more precisely counting across empty fabric to get to the next place you want to stitch, can be a little more challenging. So for example on here, counting to these individual little stitches around the outside. So what if I told you that there was a really simple little trick that you could use to help at least a little bit with counting, and that it also might make stitching feel smoother and easier and make your stitches look neater? I'm pretty sure you're here for that, and all it requires is to make the very first stitch of a piece in a particular way. Hi there stitchy friends, I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you all the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can learn more about all things stitchy, grow your stitching skills and get the most joy from your stitching. Before I dive in, I want to clarify that this quick tip only relates to stitching over 2 on even weave, like these beautiful fabrics here, or linen, like these ones here. So where you're making each stitch over 2 threads of the fabric weave. If you want to know more about stitching X over Y, then I'll link a video all about that up there in a card and also in the description. As I've already mentioned, I love stitching on even weave or linen, but I don't love when I have to count across even a few squares to get to the next spot where I'm going to stitch. There's always a risk of miscounting on any fabric, but with even weave or linen, it can just be that little bit harder because firstly the holes are smaller and therefore can be harder to see. And secondly, when you're stitching over 2 threads, there's a chance that you might be half a stitch off, which isn't something that can happen with Aida. And whilst I find that my stitches tend to lie more neatly on even weave or linen than Aida, I'm always in search of ways to make them neater with less hassle, and this tip might do that for you as well. I was very excited when I learnt about the concept of starting my stitches leaning against the post, because it's basically a triple threat. Number 1, it almost eliminates the risk of being half a stitch out. Number 2, it might make your stitching neater. And number 3, it just makes your stitching feel smoother and easier. I'm going to swap to some slides so that I can show you more easily what I mean with some diagrams, and then we'll come back and I'll demonstrate it in practice. It will vary very slightly depending on which way the top arm of your cross stitches go. So I will of course show you both ways. The first step is to identify the post. So you're looking here for a long vertical thread that's laying over a horizontal thread. You'll see I've circled a few of these on the fabric on the slide for you, but of course there's a lot more on there that I haven't circled. The next step is to identify the starting hole, so the one you're going to bring your needle up in from the back of the fabric. For those who stitch with their top arms, going from top left to bottom right, you're looking for the hole just to the bottom left of the post. If you make your top arm going from top right to bottom left, then you're looking for the hole just to the bottom right of the post. The final step is to make your first stitch. So bring your needle up in the starting hole that you've identified and make the first arm of your cross stitch up and to the right or left, depending on how you usually do it. And then you can make the second arm on top. There are of course slight variations on this if you want to make your stitch from the top hole and stitching downwards, but again, just look for the post. And you'll see that however you make your stitch, the only holes you're using are all leaning against the post. So let's see what that looks like in practice. So first I need to identify the posts on my fabric, and this is probably the hardest part because it can sometimes be tricky to see which way the fabric threads are lying depending on the fabric type, the thickness of the threads and the colour of the fabric. I find it sometimes helps to bend the fabric slightly to see where those threads are. If you bend it, you can sort of see where those vertical threads are lying. I also find that it can actually be easier to spot the post on linen compared with even weave, as the weave is often a little bit more open and the individual threads of the weave are more easily visible. So that's what I've got here. This is a piece of 32 count linen. So I'm going to look for my post, and I can see one just here. And once I've found that, I'm going to put my needle down through there, and that is just to the bottom left of the post. Now I want to bring my needle up from the back, so I'm just going to widen that slightly so that I can still see where that hole is. And then I can bring my needle up from the back, and I can see that my thread, I can check that that is in a hole just where that post is. So when I count and put my hole in the opposite, my needle in the opposite corner there, I can see that my stitch is going to be leaning against the post. So I'll push that through, and I'm doing a loop start here. If this is unfamiliar to you, what I'm doing right now, then do go back and check out my video. Again, I will link in a card and in the description on how to do a loop start. But my thread is now secure. I've got my first leg on there, and I can then just make the top leg exactly as I normally would. Don't really need to think about that one. But now that stitch is there and it's leaning against the post, all my other stitches are now going to follow exactly the same pattern. So let's see that if I were now to do my stitch so that my top arm is going in the opposite direction. So again, I'm going to need to identify a post, but I want to come up to the very bottom right of my post. So my post is here, and I've come up in the hole just to the bottom right of it. And now I'll make that stitch up to that side, and that's now leaning against the post, and then make that top arm. So that's both stitches made leaning against the post, but obviously with the top arm in this one it's going that way, and on this stitch it's facing that direction. So that's all well and good, but how does this help with counting? Well, when you know that all your stitches should be leaning against the post, when you count along, you can check that your thread is still leaning against the post. If it isn't, then you're half a stitch out, and it's time for a recount. So if I'm counting along, I want to leave a 4-stitch gap and then make my stitch here. And I've counted along, and I can see where my needle has come up. I'm actually not leaning against the post. My needle is actually sort of at the top of the post. So I've actually only counted 3.5 squares. So I know that's wrong. I can recount it, reposition my needle, and now any stitch I make from here is going to be leaning against the post again. Now, fair warning, you could still be a whole stitch out if you miscount, but at least you won't be half a stitch out. So the next question then is, well, how does this make your stitches actually look neater? Well, I don't know is the honest answer, but I think it's to do with the way the threads pull against the weave of the fabric. And they just do look neater. Sometimes. Now, I tested this previously and found that my stitches lay more neatly and evenly when I started my stitches leaning against the post. I'll pop a picture up so that you can judge for yourself, where I stitched 2 hearts, one with all the stitches leaning against the post, and one with them in the alternate position. And I thought the ones leaning against the post did look a little bit neater. But I like to put these things to a very serious testing procedure, so I have retested and I've stitched more hearts on 32 count Zweigart even weave, 28 count hand dyed even weave, and 32 count linen. Now, for reference, I didn't railroad my stitches in these tests, and if you have no idea what that means, then don't worry about it. But I do have a video explaining this technique if you want to check that out after this one. I'll link it in a card and also in the description. Now, with this testing, I think the results were a bit more mixed than I expected. The leaning against the post hearts are all on the right hand side. And whilst I think on the 28 count hand-dyed even weave, this one is visibly neater than this one, I'm not sure I can see any difference on these other two pieces. Now, I always start with my stitches leaning against the post, and I'm generally happy with the neatness of my stitching, and I often get comments on it. So, although I don't think we can be 100% definitive that it is actually neater, I'm sticking with it, just in case. And as for making the stitching experience smoother, I can't really explain this either, but I absolutely found it easier to stitch when I was starting with all my stitches leaning against the post, because my needle just seemed to find and slide through the holes much more easily. And it's such an easy thing to do because all you have to do is make sure you're in the right spot for the very first stitch, and then it all follows from there. So there's really no reason not to do this. But of course, you don't have to take my word for it, and you may not even find the same as me. But I definitely think it's worth a go. Obviously, there is a lot more to stitching on even weave or linen than just this one tip, and I will make a comprehensive tutorial at some point. But for now, I hope this tip will be helpful whether you're thinking of trying even weave or linen for the first time, or perhaps have been using it for years. If you enjoyed this video, it would be awesome if you gave it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single stitch. And it also helps these tip and tutorial videos reach and help more cross stitchers. You may also like to join my Patreon community of Stitchy friends, where I share more cross stitch goodness, including Stitchy chats, live Q&As, exclusive patterns, giveaways, early access to these videos, and much more. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching!